Box art legendaries are usually the strongest Pokemon around. They're Pokemon that are almost automatically put in the Uber tier, and that you always have to watch out for. But once in a while, there are a few box art legendaries that don't exactly cut it. So I wanted to go ahead and see what the worst box art of each gen was. To do this, I will be considering not only how they were in their debut generation, but their entire competitive career. Generation 1. There are legendary Pokemon in Gen 1. Obviously, Mewtwo, Mew, and the legendary birds, but no box arts. So since this is not the title of the video, I'll go right over to Gen 2. Ho-Oh, Lugia, and Suicune. When you think of the box arts of Gen 2, you probably think Ho-Oh and Lugia, but I think that we're way too easy to forget sometimes that Suicune is actually a box art Pokemon. Why do we forget that? You guys are so mean about that. He may be part of the legendary dogs, but he's also very much a box art. So let's get the obvious things out of the way. Ho-Oh is obviously not the worst. It was an amazing Pokemon even before heavy duty boots were introduced, and then it got Regenerator, but after that, its value really skyrocketed. However, this video isn't about the best one, so it's between Lugia and Suicune. People often talk badly about Lugia, and for good reason. I would say it was at least somewhat viable until generation 6-7-ish, but after that, it was pretty simple. Other Pokemon just did its job better. For example, if we're talking about a specially defensive wall, then there's this Pokemon called Blissey. I don't know if you've heard of them. But yeah, there's a reason people now say unban Lugia. However, because I have to consider Suicune, because it is a box art, Suicune takes the crown for the worst one. Suicune debuted in the OU tier, and it was pretty good in Gen 2. Its main role was as a defensive tank, and it was one of the Pokemon who solidified the term bulky water. Because of its access to Calm Mind, Rest, Sleep Talk, it was seemingly unkillable at times, and it had good coverage with Ice Beam and Surf. For 3 generations straight, it was an OU title holder, finally falling to UU in Generation 5, where now it's been ranked RU for quite a while. Objectively, it has a very impressive career, but it's never been an Uber Pokemon, and it's not even in the UU tier anymore, so it takes the crown for the worst box art of Gen 2. Generation 3. Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza. Generation 3 has some of the most amazing legendaries, especially in the early gens, so choosing the best legendary was very difficult because all 3 of them were incredibly powerful and meta-defining. But for a while, I would say Kyogre was by far the best one. For about 5 generations straight, it was the best Uber Pokemon actually. Up until Gen 6, when they all got their Primal/Mega form. At that point, Primal Groudon became the best legal Pokemon in Gen 6 Ubers. Legally, that is, because as we know, Mega Rayquaza would end up being banned. This continued for another generation straight. However, after the primal forms were taken away, Kyogre went back to being the best out of the trio in Gen 8. However, with Rayquaza being the worst one out of all 3. He wasn't bad, he was just genuinely an amazing wall breaker, just not as good. So there was kind of neck and neck at this point, given their competitive history, with Kyogre being the best Uber Pokemon for 5 generations straight-ish. That's literally amazing. And then Rayquaza being banned from the AG tier, and then Groudon being the best Pokemon for 2 gens straight. However, currently in Generation 9 Ubers, the Pokemon out of all of these 3 with the least impressive standing is Groudon. Kyogre is still one of the most impressive special attackers. However, there are Pokemon like Arceus Water, Ho-Oh, and Gliscor being pretty easy counters to Groudon. It's also being outdone by those same Pokemon, Arceus, Ground, Landorus, Gliscor. Even though it was the best Pokemon for 2 generations straight, it's being power crept. Quite honestly, imagine that. Out of all Pokemon, Groudon is low-key being power crept. So although it was a hard decision, I would say that the worst box art of Gen 3 is Groudon, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina are like Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, but objectively worse. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat who's not the worst, Giratina. Giratina has not aged the worst. I feel like if you were to ask the average Gen 4 Ubers player in 2005, they would have probably said that Dialga would have aged the best. Giratina was good, but just not as good as Dialga. But the reason now it's the best Pokemon out of the trio is because it's really the only defensive defogger. There aren't many hazard removal options in Generation 8 Ubers, and the only Pokemon who have access to defog aren't very good. But this isn't about him. Who is the worst Pokemon between Palkia and Dialga? Well, in Generation 4, they were both pretty great, but Dialga was pretty much the best. Palkia was a really amazing mixed attacker, but Dialga had a much better defensive prowess and access to Stealth Rock, which meant that Dialga was always a bit more relevant than Palkia. Dialga also had access to Stab version of an unnerfed Draco Meteor, and had the ability to tank it while taking neutral damage from it. However, eventually they were both victims of power creep to the point that they are completely unviable. Dialga, for example, is outdone by Necrozma Duskmane, completely to the point there is no reason to use it, and Palkia faces a lot of pressure from Eternatus. See, Palkia resisted Kyogre's Stab Water Spout, but Eternatus does this as well, and better, as well as just outspeeding it and having a better Stab Dragon type move in Dynamax Cannon. So even though they both are terrible now, for the first few gens of their competitive career, Dialga was always a bit better. So the worst boxer of Generation 4 is Palkia. Next is Generation 5. Reshiram, Zekrom, Kyurem-Black, and Kyurem-White. Gen 5 was pretty underwhelming in the legendary aspect. Honestly, if I could choose all of these to be the worst boxer legendaries, maybe I would. Kyurem-White was an insane special attacker, especially once it equipped choice specs, but it wasn't an S-tier Pokemon. However, it was still very potent. It could take on Pokemon like Kyogre with its strong Draco Meteors, so it's definitely not Kyurem-White. Next is Kyurem-Black. Kyurem-Black has a huge 170 base attack stat and was one of the Pokemon paired with Magneton in the first half of the Drag Mag strategy. It was a really intimidating substitute attacker or choice bander in the OU tier. Kyurem-Black was the only one of the Gen 5 legendaries to not actually make it to the Uber tier, since it had below average speed stat and no good boosting moves, among other reasons. So while it was great in the OU tier, it never made it to the Ubers. If we look at the viability rankings, Zekrom is ranked at B, which isn't terrible, but usually in its debut gen, boxer legendaries are at the peak of their power, but they weren't even ranked A. Zekrom had a difficult time even of its debut, dealing with Pokemon like Ferrothorn and Arceus Ground. It gets outsped by multiple other legendary Pokemon because of its base and 90 speed stat, so it got very easily power crept. Reshiram was even worse. It's susceptible to hazards, has a below average 90 speed stat, and its best stab fire type move, Blue Flare, has an 85% accuracy, and it would get walled pretty easily by Blissey, Chansey, and multiple Arceus forms, and even the ever-present Kyogre. So Reshiram, who was already worse than Zekrom, would get power crept even easier. And Reshiram got cemented as one of the worst legendaries, but I can't say it's the worst legendary because Kyurem-Black also exists. So Kyurem-Black is the worst boxer at this gen because although it would later go on to get banned and go to the OU tier, I feel like the fact that it debuted in the OU tier holds it back from beating Reshiram, but I can see why someone would consider Reshiram. Generation 6, Yveltal and Xerneas. Gen 6 has two amazing boxer legendaries. Yveltal is an amazing Pokemon. It has great typing and dark and flying, makes it possibly the greatest dark type attacker of all time, with its access to stab knockoff, foul play, sucker punch, and its 131 attack stat, which is brutal. Not only that, but it has access to its signature move Oblivion Wing, as well as Heat Wave, Dark Pulse, and Focus Blast. And although it was a Pokemon who was incredibly offensively menacing, it was also able to be rather tanky because of its HP stat, which is at 126. It was an amazing Pokemon against the very popular Arceus Ghost, and because it was a mixed attacker, it was one of the few special attackers that could take on Chansey, and it could even take on Ho-Oh. Normally, there's no way another Pokemon could outdo it, unless that Pokemon was named Xerneas. Xerneas is a top 3 special attacker of all time. It has a huge 131 attack stat, but doesn't even use it or need it because of its 131 special attack stat, which is already amazing. What sets it apart is the fact that it has access to the best boosting move of all time, in Geomancy, a move that takes 2 turns to use, unless you're using a power herb, which it almost always does. It doubles your speed, special attack, and special defense. There were very few ways to take it on. Even the almighty Chansey had to watch out for its focus blast. Although they aren't in Gen 9 Ubers because of Dexit, when they were both in the games, they were amazing. But Xerneas was far more amazing, so although Yveltal is really goated, sadly it wins the contest for the worst boxers of Gen 6. Next is Gen 7. Lunala, Solgaleo, Necrozma Duskmane, and Necrozma Duskmane. So let's get this out of the way. It's not Necrozma Duskmane, he's amazing. One of the main reasons Dialga is not relevant right now. And it's not Lunala because although she is almost always in the shadow of Necrozma Duskmane, her ability Shadow Shield, combined with boosting moves like Calm Mind and Agility, makes her an incredible sweeper. So it's between Solgaleo and Necrozma Duskmane. Well, let's start with analyzing Necrozma Duskmane. Well, there's no easy way to say this, there's almost no viable way to use it. It's supposed to be a better version of Lunala, however, its ability Prism Armor is objectively worse than Shadow Shield. It also has a low speed and a 4 times weakness to Dark. It has barely any niche, so you would think that it's the worst Pokemon, but you're wrong, that would be Solgaleo. This is going to be short. Why use Solgaleo when you can use Necrozma Duskmane? It has higher stats and a better ability, and because of that, it can't make up for any of its unfortunate aspects. There's no reason to use it. Solgaleo is the worst. Gen 8, Zacian and Zamazenta. This one is very easy and very short. It's Zamazenta. No one used Zamazenta at first. Zamazenta had 2 problems. It is a defensive Pokemon with a typing that is fairly bad defensively, and a Pokemon with terrible move pool. And by that I mean, it's a defensive Pokemon with a huge physical attack stat without access to Body Press. Later on, it would go on to obtain that move. However, by that point, it would drop to the OU tier. All meanwhile, Zacian is Zacian, so Zamazenta wins sadly. Generation 9, Koraidon and Miraidon. Koraidon and Miraidon are 2 amazing Pokemon. Koraidon is an amazing Pokemon with multiple sets, and they're all very difficult to deal with. And especially when you add Terra Fire to it and realize that you can't even Will-O-Wisp it, it becomes even more difficult to deal with. However, its counterpart Miraidon is better pretty much just because it got banned. Now, it wouldn't be banned immediately, it would actually take several months, but it would happen anyways. There's honestly weren't many Pokemon that could take it on, It's only checks and encounters, quote unquote, or it even checks encounters. Pokemon like Tinglu, Arceus Ground, who would normally check it, can't really take multiple of its hits, like his Draco Meteors. So while Koraidon is literally the best Pokemon right now, it also wins, because Miraidon is currently in the AGH year. That was what I personally think is the worst box art of every single gen. Feel free to disagree though, because I know that it's kind of subjective.